Swinburne University of Technology.
Hi postgraduate students, we're here looking at the PhD Hub again. I'm Professor Josie Arnold and I'm talking to Professor Sandy Gifford, who is the Professor of Anthropology and Refugee Studies in our research centre. And I'm going to ask Sandy about her work, and then I'm going to ask her about how she works with her PhD and postgraduate students in this area. So first of all, Sandy, it's a very interesting area, very contemporary area to talk about refugee studies and ethnographic studies of people in Australia. So perhaps you could tell me a little bit about the work that you do yourself.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Josie. Yeah, it's both an exciting area and a challenging area, and that's one of the dilemmas, I guess, of the research. So I'm an anthropologist. Medical anthropologist by training, which means that I've traditionally worked very much in an applied sector with multidisciplinary teams, never worked as an isolated anthropologist. And I've been working on refugee issues probably for 15 years. Got started very much in the practical sector, working with NGOs who were doing a lot of settlement work. And so my research really tries to combine the very applied issues around refugee settlement with more of the scholarship that's happening, particularly in terms of, you know, how we can understand how people come and how they make a life after having quite a traumatic and disrupted, you know, experience prior to that.
So you're talking about actual research on to and about people, but that can not only become academic knowledge, but is also probably able to be seen by the government for policy reasons.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge. And it's one that I must say, it's a big challenge and one that we discuss a lot with my PhD students, because prior to working in refugee studies, I worked in public health. And I worked in public health as an anthropologist, both in the academic sector, but I've also worked for the State Health Department, and I've done work with like United Nations High Commission on Refugees, and with international development. And one of the real challenges is that in public health, you might be able to do a great piece of research, gathering evidence. I used to work in an HIV and hepatitis C policy, both here as well as in Cambodia and in India. And the real dilemma is translating that evidence into policy. And that is not always possible, but it's always really important to be able to make sure that your research has some resonance with current contemporary problems.
And that it's there if people need to refer to it or are open-minded enough to refer to it.
Absolutely, and a lot of times in the policy context what they say is, look, you have to do good research in partnership with, you know, affected people or whatever, and that often for policy you have to wait till the gap opens up for somebody to say, yeah, now where is the evidence? You know, where is the research?
So where would your most of your PhD candidates come from? Would they come from the health sciences? No,
not anymore. They used to till probably about 15 years ago. Most of them were health sciences, very much social issues in health. Now they would come from policy, gender studies, very interdisciplinary. So one of the best things that I've done, it's my best research. We've been doing a longitudinal study looking at settlement of young people over time. So we started that about 10 years ago. It's very multi-method, from in-depth ethnography using arts-based methods to epidemiology. I also have a degree in epidemiology, so I work with quantitative colleagues as well. We've followed 120 young people when they were 13 to 14 years old to now they're in their 28, 29, having, you know, families of their own. That has actually provided a great base for PhD students. So one of my students, for example, did lots of ethnographic work with the Karen community out in Nunawading, and she actually won a prize for one of the best Swinburne PhD thesis last year. It was fantastic. Yeah. Combining anthropology, photography, drawings, but also in-depth interviews. Another one of my students, for example, is working very much on issues of entrepreneurship and women who have refugee backgrounds. She's right in the middle of her PhD, but working with the business faculty and with me, I'm her major supervisor, comparing women here to women in Brazil who are doing a lot of informal entrepreneurship. Again, using a whole bunch of mixed methods and different sort of theoretical perspectives. But I'd have to say that most of the students have a very, not only a good theoretical focus, but also a very practical and applied focus. So they're students who want to make a difference, but it's not straight advocacy research. It's, you know, and one of the things that I think is really important is to be pretty rigorous on the methods. Yeah. So for all of my career, I've taught methods. I mean, when I did my postgraduate training, I did like 2 years of methods. When in anthropology, and you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from the United States, we had to do like 1.5 years of methods training and qual methods, and then I did training in public health as well on methods. And I think it's really important in whatever research you do to have work up a fairly clear idea of what you're going to do, and that often changes throughout the research process, particularly when you're dealing with applied problems, because you don't have a lab that you're controlling people in. But also to be really clear about what your design is, so you can tell people, this is what I did, and this is how I did it, and this is why I did it, and this is what I found, and these are the limitations, but these are also the learnings.
And briefly, they would probably be the sections you would expect in a PhD?
Yeah, and they are the sections, and most of my, well, I would say, you know, I've supervised probably throughout my career. I've been at different unis. I've probably have about 25 PhD students now that have completed, maybe more. And I guess one of the really important things is to be really pretty robust on your methods. And I don't mean being narrow, because I'm quite eclectic in methods, but to make sure that they're well-grounded, and then to have some kind of a theoretical orientation, which I don't always mean high theory, but to have a good sense of where you stand in your discipline and within the broader policy context as well.
And that would be a section in itself, a theoretical section, and by theory, of course, we mean a scholarly prism through which we can look at the problems or the ideas or the information. Or would you like to talk slightly about that?
Yeah, it's you know, how are you going to situate yourself and make sense of you know, how you're looking at your data. I'll use the word data. But so, for example, in our longitudinal study with young people, one of the I would say broad theoretical constructs or frameworks that I look at has to do with some of the theories of belonging and sense of identity and well-being. Right. Now, those are huge areas. So, you know, so many different disciplines have takes on that. So you have to narrow it down. But very clearly, those would be 3 constructs that are really important for, it's almost the frame around the picture.
Yes. And so that narrowing it down is really important, isn't it? That you focus your area of research, because I suppose in the PhD journey it generally is like a diamond. You go right out and think you can do everything, and then you have to come back, would you think?
Absolutely. And you know what, over all the students I've ever supervised, the typical thing is students start, they know where they're going, you know, they got their literature down. 6 months in, they come and they say, oh my goodness, there's too much. I'm totally confused. I've read all this and I should read more here and more there and more there. So it's like, it's the process of saying, yes, the world is huge. And one of the challenges of finishing your PhD is if you don't finish it, then your lit review just keeps going, because more and more is published. Right. You know, it's really good. So you have to say, all right, let's bring it back in. This is what I'm doing, and this is what I'm not doing. And that's so important too, because, you know, from a pragmatic point of view, I mean, you know, when you're thinking about your assessors, for me, I would be looking at identity through the lens of anthropology and also through ethnicity and multiculturalism. So I would never want to have a psychologist be assessing my work, because I just don't do
that kind of
that
work.
kind of work.
Yes.
And so what you have to think about is not only what feels right. I mean, that's also really important when you're reading theory. What do you like? Do you know, what do you like? What's engaging? But also to think really clearly about how you're going to, what makes most sense for what you're looking at and who's going to assess you, you know, so that you can make sure that you're saying this is what I'm doing and this is what I'm not doing.
And you talked about time there, and the university likes our students to complete in 3 years, and we all do. This doesn't always happen, but I think students don't realise how important it is to focus early as they can, make that journey and then focus early so that they can finish. Now, what do you think about that, and in particular with the impact of longitudinal studies?
Well, they wouldn't be able to do it. No, I mean a longitudinal study.
But they might be able to do an aspect of it.
They can. And so, for example, like in our longitudinal studies, we have 6 years, over 10 years of a lot of data, in-depth stuff. So they could take part of that if they were working like on my study. And there are different ways. I mean, longitudinal work also could you know, have people reflecting back. You can use all sorts of different data. I mean, one of the studies that I've just finished was with the city of Melbourne, and we had 2 PhD students on that, and we were working with artists, producing, working with young people from refugee backgrounds, and they were producing movies, videos, collaborating over the internet with their peers who were still back in refugee camps. And so we had 2 PhDs nested into that study. And so that wasn't a longitudinal study, but it was a very collaborative, participatory study, again, using a whole range of methods. And the challenge there was to carve out a little bit of that study that was doable as a PhD, because you're so right. I mean, a PhD now is 3 years. It's not the Nobel Prize, and it's probably not the best bit of work that a student will do, but it's the only time they have 3 years, well, particularly if they're on a scholarship, to be paid to do something they love. But it's also a task of then putting some boundaries around it, particularly in 3 years. I mean, basically, you know, 3 years is getting going yesterday, you know, not thinking you can get going tomorrow. And, you know, by the end of the first year, having a chapter, having your introduction, your review written, even though in year 3 you'll go back and redo it. And in the area that I work, then, you know, data collection in year 2, but that doesn't mean you stop writing. Like when I did my PhD a long, long time ago, you'd have a year to do your data collection and not very much else. And here, I think, you know, now you've got to keep writing every day, even though you're doing your data collection and your analysis. Year 3 analysis and get it written. And it's working backwards. So you have that completion date.
Yes, that's right.
Do backwards, like
what steps do you have?
Not working forward. Start from that date and go backwards, and it could get really scary.
Well, I'm a great believer as a writer in facing the blank page and filling it in.
Yes.
What do you think?
Exactly. Do you know, it's that, you're right. So last year, I'll tell you, Josie, so I'm an academic writer, and last year, for my birthday, I gave myself a creative writing course, which I have never done. I did it online. And I'll tell you, the adage was write every single day. And at the end of the 6 weeks, I had 1,000 words I had to produce by the next morning at 8 a.m. And I stayed up all night and I did it. And it was probably total garbage. Well, I actually don't think it was, but I did it. And I should have done that kind of course when I did my PhD. And even now, you know, I try to write, you know, between 250 and 500 words a day, and sometimes, you know, 5 days a week, you know.
I try to write 1,000 words a day, 3 or 4 days a week.
You're really good. Sometimes,
I'm a writer, so I should be.
Well, academics are writers too, but sometimes I just look at that screen and I just say, okay, type. You know. Sometimes, you know, I take my notebook and I tell my students this too. If you're really stuck, go buy yourself a really nice notebook, get yourself a nice pen, and go off to a cafe. And I happen to live in Fitzroy, so I have about 4 cafes that I feel very comfortable sitting and writing. And if I'm really stuck, I just leave that computer alone.
Yes, and I'm a great believer too in the dot points and the plan.
Yes.
And heads and subheads. I don't have to fill them in yet.
Absolutely.
But if I know where I'm going, then that's very useful.
It's so useful. And you know, sometimes when I'm really stuck, or when one of my students is stuck, we look at that, because I'm, like you, a believer. Put the dot points down. Look at those. Now, which of those dot points do you think you could write some words on?
Right.
Oh yeah, I could write that. You know, some students will come back. Let's just, one of my students just got back from Kuala Lumpur. She spent a year there working with Rohingya. And so she's starting to write up. And I said, well, write the background of your field site. You've been there for a year. You could write about KL. You can do maps. You can write what it smells like. Yeah, I could do that. So sit down and write it.
So what you're saying is that in this kind of area of scholarly writing, you can combine the empirical and the narrative.
Absolutely.
You can combine the data and the personal, the self as data.
Absolutely.
And you get up this rich mix.
Yeah.
You think that's a useful way
It's
for
really,
the
really
students
useful. And actually, it's extremely useful, but then students have to also figure out where their discipline is and where their supervisors are. So, for example, I have had, in anthropology, the I is very common. You know, you can write in first person in the narrative, where you're mixing your empirical, being rigorous on it, but also with the personal. And in anthropology, you almost always have to put yourself into your thesis in one way or another. You know, there are different ways to do it. And I've co-supervised with very good colleagues, either in public health and or in sociology, where it's always third person.
Yes.
And so one of the challenges is for students to early on figure out what their style is and to negotiate it with their supervisors so they know how they're doing that.
Well, in anthropology, I guess there's a fairly wide range of ways in which to write, because of course autoethnography comes from anthropology.
That's right.
So that sense that you are, which we use a lot in the writing,
Yes.
you are talking, you are the data, you are yourself, and we use a reflective journal a lot. Do your students use reflective journals, or are they useful in your area?
They use field note journals.
Which I guess is similar.
It's probably similar, because I tell my students take 3 kinds of notes. One is just observation, okay? One is how you're feeling about it, you know, yourself in the field. And the third are analytic, that you think, well, maybe it means this, and what does it mean that? And I've always tell them, it's interesting, because I always say, okay, your field notes, you don't have to open them up to everybody. They are your data, in addition to anything else you're doing. But the reflective field notes are really important, because not only is it important psychologically, you know, and emotionally, it helps to anchor you back in what was happening at that time when you read them.
And the other thing that we notice from that journal, broadly speaking, is the same thing as the field notes, are that issues arise which become the areas that you look at the literature around. So you think, oh yeah, I was in Rohingya and I found da-da-dum, and then you think, oh, there's probably a lot on that. I mean, you know, I say to my students, Google Scholar, everyone said something about something.
Yeah.
You'll find something. So what do you think about that?
No, I totally agree. That, you know, basically it's interesting, because the old adage in anthropology, which I tell my students too, is, you know, take an hour or 2 at the end of the day and write your field notes up, even though you've scribbled them.
Yes.
So it's that process of reflection, because it is saying, you know, this is what happened, and how can I make sense of that, and does this then link to a particular body of other research or theory? It's that back and forth, isn't it? It's not just leaving it. It's all of that back and forth.
And I think sometimes that's difficult for our PhD students to understand. It doesn't have to be all that they're thinking and doing.
Exactly.
That there's a body of knowledge within their work. Do you think that's a difficult transition?
Well, you know, I think a lot of students come into it thinking they have to do something totally unique and original. Well, let's be honest, you know, good research is collaborative, and it's building on ideas and sharing it. And I think, yeah, you have to have a new spin and twist on it. It is your own work and ideas, but certainly part of the process is being enriched on what other people think, argue, and say. Yeah.
And I think metaphorically about this like a pearl, you know, you've got the problem at the core, and then people have got little bits of nacre around the outside, and you'll add one more layer to it. Do you think that's a good metaphor?
Yeah, it's interesting. It is a good metaphor.
Because you don't have to create the whole pearl, do you? I mean, some people do, like Stephen Hawking, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true. But those people are rare,
Very rare, yeah.
few and far between.
Yeah.
But you know, I see it also as I mean, look, the PhD can be a lonely process, but it can also be an opportunity to really robustly engage with ideas written and other. And you know, crafting your ideas around that can be like a dance. The pearl is really an interesting metaphor, because I think, yeah, there are those wild, what are they, oysters? Is that right?
Yeah,
are they oysters?
yeah.
Wild oysters out there that make beautiful pearls. Nobody ever touches them, but probably nobody ever finds them either. And then there are all the cultured pearl. That, you know, it's a dance.
Well, I see from just talking with you here how exciting research is and how interesting it is, and particularly in the very challenging contemporary field you're in. Is that how your students address themselves to it, do you think?
Yeah, you know, all the students that I've supervised, worked with, almost at the end, we're colleagues in some ways. They come in because they're passionate about something. And then I think, though, that what I've always seen is around 2.5 years in, they're sick of it, and they want to get it done. And so no matter how, and that's why having structure and making progress as you're going is really important, because I can't even think of one student I've ever had who is excited at 2.5 years as they were when they first started.
But are they at the end, do you think? No.
They are at the end.
So there's
but
kind
you
of
know,
a little wave in there.
There is, but you know, Josie, maybe this is qualitative research, I don't know, but a phenomena that I find so commonly happens, and I actually did it when I did my research, is you get to the point where you have a whole draft done, and they think, and I remember doing this, did I make this up? Did I make this up? And then, is it valid? Is it real research? And that's why it's really important to be able to say yes, because this is how I did it. This is the body of scholarship I drew on and engaged with. You know, it's that.
Yes.
But there always is this bit of self-doubt just when you're almost going to get that first draft done.
And I suppose that's a good description of scholarship too, isn't it? That we have to be doubtful to be doing it.
I think so. I think so, and I think if a student is overconfident, then, you know, and you say, oh, I know it all, well, first of all, you're right. Why do it?
Yes.
And secondly, you might want to be a little bit cautious. Yeah.
Well, Sandy, that's been a terrific introduction for many students to what it is to look at a really very contemporary area of research in ethnography and in thinking and in community problems. And I'm sure that we've all learned a lot from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josie.
This has been a Swinburne production.